arguably the most talent-stacked era for goaltending in the NHL. The 2010s was filled with some of the league's most highly skilled and impactful talents that truly helped change the position into what it is today. Some of these guys will go down as bona fide Hall of Famers, while some of them have become some of the league's best and brightest talents that we've ever seen. Now, this is one of those videos that I had a hard time tackling because in the 2010s, there was a plethora of goalies that could be considered for a top 10 list. But you know how we do it on this channel. We don't cop out of anything. So today I'm going to be giving you my top 10 goalies list from the 2010 decade. I thought of a bunch of different ways to rate this list and talk about it because some goalies played in the 2000s decade but still continued playing in 2010s, and some of these guys are still even playing today, like Marc-Andre Fleury. But what we're going to be talking about today here is the goalies who I think were the most consistent, who won the most games, and who really kept up the best numbers throughout that 10-year decade from 2010 to 2020. So if you guys have been liking the content lately and you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, what are you doing? Make sure you do that now. It lets you know when I post new fun content like this, and let's get right into this one. Every top 10 list should have an honorable mention section, so we're going to begin with that before we get into the 1 through 10 list, beginning with Kari Lehtonen, Corey Crawford, Craig Anderson, Jimmy Howard, Ben Bishop, Martin Brodeur, and many more guys who probably deserve to be on this list, but just came up short because there was just so much talent at the time. So let's begin our list with number 10. Coming in at number 10, I have Braden Holtby, who was easily the biggest mainstay for the Washington Capitals throughout the entire 2010s, and arguably is the biggest reason why this team won their Stanley Cup back in 2018. Focusing on Braden Holtby's career though, he joined the Washington Capitals back in 2010 and finished his tenure with the team exactly at the end of the decade in the 2019-20 season. Braden Holtby was incredible throughout that stretch, starting his career with the Caps with a .934 save percentage and eventually finishing out still with strong numbers with a .911 save percentage. He was their clear starter, and like I mentioned earlier, I don't know if without that run that he had in 2018 that this team would have actually won a Stanley Cup that year. If you take a look at his numbers during that playoff run that season, Braden Holtby averaged a .922 save percentage with a 2.16 goals against average. Again, one of the best performances I've seen in a playoff run in a very long time. I'll never forget that one save he made against the Vegas Golden Knights. Easily one of my top 10 goalies of the decade, and I think he deserves a lot more credit just for how consistent he was throughout that run with the Washington Capitals. Coming in at number 9, I have a guy who some people consider to be more of a 2000s goalie, but I think his numbers in the 2010s was actually a little bit more impressive. Roberto Luongo, traded to the Florida Panthers in 2014, not only had a great first half to the decade with the Vancouver Canucks, but continued that dominance with the Florida Panthers all the way to the very end. In fact, the only real bad season that Roberto Luongo had was in his final year, where he started in 40 games and only averaged an .899 save percentage, which I honestly want to just take off the board because if you look at the rest of his numbers throughout his career, he was nothing short of dominant. Coming up just short for the Vancouver Canucks in 2011, it was really his only real chance at a Stanley Cup, unfortunately. But I think if you look at Roberto Luongo throughout the league's vast history, most people would probably consider him to be a top 10 goalie of all time at this point. But when we're talking about just guys in this decade, I feel like I can't really put him any higher because there were so many other guys on this list who were incredible and put up way better consistent numbers than Roberto Luongo. Still, he's one of the top 10 guys from this decade. He was easily one of the most exciting tendies to watch during that time period, and his numbers really speak for themselves. Roberto Luongo lands number 9 on my list. Coming in at number 8, I have a guy who I think is incredibly underrated for his performance in this decade, and that's Pekka Rinne. Unfortunately, because we win in such a championship culture sports environment now, Pekka Rinne might go down as one of those guys that will never really be remembered because he didn't win a championship. But if you were watching hockey during this time, you'll know exactly what type of goalie he was. He was the guy who never made those flashy big time saves, but was so consistent positionally that as a goalie, he was incredibly fun to watch. Putting up some amazing numbers throughout the 2010s, he began the decade with a .930 average save percentage and finished it off with arguably one of the worst seasons of his career as he eventually transitioned that starting role to UC Saros. Pekka Rinne again is underrated for this decade based on the numbers that he put up. He was never able to win a Stanley Cup, but came so close, just like Roberto Luongo in his one opportunity. Pekka Rinne will go down as one of the best goalies in NHL history, but for this decade, I have him at number 8. I considered to move him higher, but I do think there's a few guys on this list who still deserve to be a bit higher. This isn't really a discredit though, because you guys heard how much talent there is in this decade, so I'm going to leave him at this position. Coming in at number 7, I have Andrei Vasilevskiy, a guy who some of you may think should be higher on this list, but I have to keep him a little bit lower considering the fact that he really didn't play the entire decade. In fact, he didn't even play half of the decade, really. Beginning his career in 2014, he became a backup for Ben Bishop until 2016, where he really became their starter. In that timeline, though, he posted a .917 save percentage, a .920 save percentage, a .925 save percentage, and then a .917 save percentage, also winning himself Stanley Cups in that timeline. I think when it comes down to it, Andrei Vasilevskiy might be the most clutch goaltender of all time. I don't know if there's a guy out there who I would take over him at this point. Based on the injuries that he's had over the past couple of seasons, people forget his game and just how great this guy is between the pipes. But don't let that fool you. Andrei Vasilevskiy is still a top 5 goalie in the world today, and during the later days of the 2010s decade, he was dominant and belongs on this top 10 list. I just can't bump him any higher because of just how little he played during that era. But don't worry, when it comes to the 2020s and we talk about this, once this decade is over, I'm sure a lot of people will have him at least 1 or 2. Coming in at number 6, I have a recent Stanley Cup winning champion, Sergei Bobrovsky. Now, for me especially, I feel like over the past 2 years, I've seen more out of Bobrovsky than I did basically from 2015 to 2020. But regardless of all of that, during the early stages of his career, there was no bigger fan of Sergei Bobrovsky than I. I used to walk around in a Columbus Blue Jackets jersey and t-shirt wearing his number because I just loved everything about his game. As a kid who was just playing goalie all the time, there was no better guy to model your game after. I mean, seriously, he was that good. If you take a look at his stint with the Columbus Blue Jackets, I don't know if there was a better goalie in the league than Sergei Bobrovsky, especially in 2012, 2013, and 2016, 2017, where he averaged over a .930 save percentage and just around a 2 goals against average. I mean, goalie Bob was nothing short of exceptional during this timeline and really made the Columbus Blue Jackets a much better team than they probably were on paper. There's only a handful of guys who I would consider to be slightly better than Sergei Bobrovsky, but I could see the arguments from anyone saying that he was a top 10 guy from the decade. Had he been playing on a team that structured a little bit better of a roster around him, I think he easily could have won a cup or two before this one that he just won with the Florida Panthers. Now, here's where things may get controversial on my list, and if you guys remember what I said at the start, I'm basing these numbers off of how consistent these guys were over the decade, not based on team performance and Stanley Cup wins, because if we were going off Stanley Cup wins, then this would be a completely different list. I'm talking about the pure raw numbers. So coming in at number 5, I have Jonathan Quick. Yes, he might be a little bit lower, but I think the numbers that the guys above him put up were just slightly better than his, just so slightly. Jonathan Quick, throughout his tenure with the Los Angeles Kings, had some amazing years, but he also had some down years as well. If you take a look at some of his numbers beginning back in 2007, he didn't really become a starter until around 2009, playing in 72 games, if you can even fathom that goalies were playing that much back then. But regardless, he averaged a .914 save percentage in his first half year as a starter, then a .907 in his first 72 game season, and then after that you can kind of see his numbers go from .918, .929 to .902, .915, .918, .918, .917, .921, and then he completely falls off a cliff with an .888, a .904 in his final 2 seasons of the decade. Not exactly the most consistent thing if you ask me. Now, there was a stretch there where he had some amazing numbers, but when I compare that to some of the other guys on this list, I just couldn't really justify putting him over them because we're talking about consistency throughout the entire decade. Jonathan Quick, a 3-time Stanley Cup champion and a Conn Smythe winner, was never actually a Vezina winner, and when we're talking about the top goalies in the league, I feel like that has to be considered here. Jonathan Quick was never the best goalie in the NHL. Think about that. He never won a Vezina trophy. He never put up the best numbers, so how can I put him in the top 4 above other guys who had such great numbers throughout their career as well? Now, when it comes to Jonathan Quick, this isn't a hate piece. He was one of my favorite goalies growing up. I think he's easily a top 5 from that decade, just for how well he played in the playoffs as well. If you remember some of those spectacular saves that he made, keeping the LA Kings in a ton of playoff series, he deserves nothing but love and credit. Jonathan Quick lands at number 5 on my list. Coming in at number 4, I have a guy who I think every hockey fan absolutely loves, a guy who could be considered a 2000s goalie, but again, I think his numbers were better in the 2010s, so I'm including him on this list, and that's Marc-Andre Fleury. Winning his first cup back in 2008 and then 2 more in 2015 and 16 with the Pittsburgh Penguins, Marc-Andre Fleury lands so high on my list because of the consistency that he's had throughout his entire career. And during the 2010s, he really had arguably the best numbers from any goaltender in the league, beginning with a .918 save percentage He only had one season throughout that stretch where it was a little bit subpar, and that was in 2016, the year where really Matt Murray ended up becoming the starter for the Pittsburgh Penguins. He then would follow that up with a Vezina winning season with the Vegas Golden Knights, nearly winning a fourth Stanley Cup with that organization. What's not to love about Marc-Andre Fleury? On and off the ice, he's an incredible talent. He has some of the greatest saves I've ever seen from a goalie throughout both playoff and regular season hockey, and I think if anybody looks back on that decade, they would consider him to be a top 5 guy. I have him landing at number 4. I think there was only 3 guys from this decade who were slightly better than him, but that's not taking any credit away from Marc-Andre Fleury. He's an exceptional talent, and I think he's going to go down as a top 3 goalie all time when his career is finished. Coming in at number 3, I have 2 U's, 2 K's, 2 points, Tuukka Rask. This guy was easily one of the more consistent guys throughout the decade, especially when you consider how many times he probably could have won a Vezina trophy with the Boston Bruins, taking over arguably one of the greatest goaltending performances we've ever seen from Tim Thomas. Tuukka Rask had a very big task, and he did it with flying colors afterwards from Tim Thomas. Looking at his numbers from the start of his decade with the Boston Bruins, he really became a starter back in 2012, where he had a .929 save percentage, followed it up with a .930, a .922, .915, .915, .917, .912, and capped it off in 2019 with a .929 save percentage. Again, the only reason I'm giving him a little bit of a flack here is because some of his numbers during the playoffs weren't all that great. During the 2018-19 season, yes, he put up some amazing numbers and the Bruins just couldn't rally behind him. But back when he was playing in some of those other playoff series like 2017 and then again in 2019, Rask just really didn't perform during that era. And I feel like he could have won them a Stanley Cup had the Bruins just done a little bit more around him. But regardless, I'm keeping him top 3. His goals against average and save percentage, along with the amount of times this guy would get a shutout, was nothing short of exceptional. I have Tuukka Rask at number 3. He's my favorite goalie of all time, and I think he deserves a lot more credit for keeping the Bruins relevant for so long throughout that decade. Coming in at number 2, I have a guy who some people might consider to be number 1, but I think he's number 2 at this point, so that's where I'm going to leave him. Carey Price. Carey Price with the Montreal Canadiens is exactly what you're looking for in a goalie, a guy who plays incredibly well, lifts your team up when you don't have a roster that's eligible for the playoffs, really, and still gets you in. I think when it comes to Carey Price, I really wish that he eventually played on a different team, just because I would have loved to see him lift a cup, especially after that year when they were playing in the bubble and he nearly did the impossible, taking a team that had no business being in the Stanley Cup Finals almost to the promised land, but unfortunately got knocked out. The end of his career is a little bit sad to watch. Injuries and of course off-ice issues really just kind of took a toll on Price, but when he was in the league, his numbers were dominant and you would have a hard time picking another guy over him. Again, I only have one guy who I think was slightly better during this decade, but Carey Price was one of the most entertaining and highly skilled goalies to watch throughout this decade, so I have him landing at number 2. Coming in at number 1, I have the King of New York himself, Henrik Lundqvist. Arguably the most good-looking man in all of hockey, Henrik Lundqvist has become a staple icon in the hockey world and will go down as arguably one of the most fan-favorited goalies throughout the league's history. I mean, you would have a hard time not rooting for this guy. He put up incredible numbers every year, but the New York Rangers just couldn't surround him with the talent to finally push through and earn him a Stanley Cup. He won a Vezina trophy back in 2011-2012 where he averaged a .930 save percentage and a 1.97 goals against average, and basically throughout the entire decade he averaged a .920 save percentage. Those are some ridiculous numbers for a guy who was never able to really push through and earn himself a Stanley Cup, but even in the Stanley Cup playoffs it was never really his fault why the New York Rangers lost. Look at his playoff numbers as well. From 2011 to 2014, when the Rangers were kind of in that prime era to win a cup, he basically averaged a .930 save percentage throughout the entire run, and that's just sad to see that he was never able to become a champion. Regardless though, I have him as my number 1 goalie from that decade. I think his numbers speak for themselves, his value that he's brought to the game, it genuinely speaks volumes to me. I love him as a goalie, and I think he's the best goalie from the 2010s decade. But let me know what you guys think about my list. I'm just going to reiterate it real quickly for you. These are my top 10 goalies from the 2010 decade of the NHL. At number 10, I have Braden Holtby. At number 9, I have Roberto Luongo. At number 8, I have Pekka Rinne. Number 7, I have Andrei Vasilevskiy. Number 6, I have Sergei Bobrovsky. Number 5, I have Jonathan Quick. Number Number 4, Marc-Andre Fleury. Number 3, Tuukka Rask. Number 2, Carey Price. And at number 1, I have Henrik Lundqvist. But let me know what you guys think again in the comments below. What would you change about my list? Do you think that other people belong in the top 10, or do you think that a couple of these guys need to be moved around? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure you like this video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and I will see you guys in the next one.